right. Well, Whitney, thank you so much for being here on the podcast today. I've got to say that, and we were talking before the podcast got started. Your work and your work on personal disruption and your book we're going to be talking about today, I feel is so relevant in today's world. The other thing I'll mention to our listeners too is you also have a great podcast. And this morning I had mentioned this to you, but I was listening to the episode you did with my father, and also the one you did with Mike Rowe, who I love Mike Rowe, and it's just an amazing stuff. So not only do listeners need to read this book that we're going to be talking about today, but they also need to check out your podcast because the work that you're doing is amazing. So again, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you, Stephen. I'm delighted to be here.
Yes. So first question I wanted to ask you about is I know that you worked with Clayton Christensen, who was such an amazing individual and had such a huge impact, just from thought leadership and his frameworks that he shared in the world. And since you worked with him, I wanted to ask you, what was it like to work with Clayton Christensen? And what kind of impact did he have both in your professional and personal life?
Well, first of all, he is an amazing man, and I miss him terribly. My next book that's coming out, I actually dedicated it to him, to say that he made what I'm doing professionally possible. So that sets the stage for his influence on me. Let me tell you a couple of quick stories to illustrate this. So I was working as an equity analyst on Wall Street, covering telecom and media in the emerging markets. And I was building my financial models every quarter, and every quarter they kept beating my estimates. This is the early 2000s, and I was trying to figure out what is happening. Why do they keep beating my numbers? And then I came across Clayton Christensen and his book, The Innovator's Dilemma, where he talked about disruptive innovation and how a silly little thing can take over the world. And I realized when I read his book, oh, that's what's happening. Wireless is disrupting wireline. You have these phones, the sound quality isn't very good. It's this silly little thing, but for people who cannot afford a landline, bad sound quality is better than no sound. And so people were just scooping up these phones. And so that was my first really big introduction to him and his work, of having this explanatory mechanism of what was happening in the companies that I was covering as a stock analyst. But from there, as I studied his work, and I remember I was reading The Innovator's Dilemma, pouring through it, underlining lots of pages. I just had a conversation with one of my bosses and had said, I feel like there's more for me to do. I've been an institutional investor ranked analyst for several years now, probably at this point it's 7 years, and I want to do something more. And they said something to me akin to, "We like you right where you are." And I remember thinking and putting those pieces together of this idea of, oh, disruption isn't just about products, it's also about people. And if I'm going to accomplish what I feel like I need to accomplish in life, may need to disrupt myself. And so I made the decision to leave Wall Street, become an entrepreneur. And so his work was seminal, formative in my making that decision. First of all, understanding what was happening in the stock market, but also personally making a decision to make a big move in my career. And then the last thing that I will say in terms of his influence, and I think in some ways this is the most important influence, is he was a man who did not separate the secular from the spiritual. So he brought his secular life, all of his education and intellectual capacity and acumen into his spiritual life, but he also brought his spiritual life and his belief in God to his work life and his secular life. And that, I think, in many ways is probably the most important legacy for me as a human being as I develop and grow, is to never separate and compartmentalize both the secular and the spiritual, to put those two pieces together.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that and sharing that experience with Clayton. I've always been struck watching him. I never had the opportunity to really meet and talk with him, but I knew he knew my grandfather well, and I'm always very struck when when I've watched recordings of him, just what you said, where he would be talking in front of an audience, right, a business audience, and he would bring up God in that context. But to him, it wasn't like he was trying to beat you over the brow with it or something. It's just who he was. It was genuinely who he was. And I've always noticed and admired that about him as well. Again, not just from the outside, kind of looking in and seeing him. Such an amazing influence. So again, thank you for sharing that. Another kind of question, we're talking about the origin of your book, Disrupt Yourself. So would you say, you had mentioned it the first time that you said, okay, you're using these kind of this disruptive frameworks in an investing context and looking at companies that way. And then when you transitioned to become an entrepreneur, that was kind of the moment where you said, oh, I can apply this framework to my own self. Was that kind of the genesis of the starting of the book? Or I really like to always hear kind of the origin of the book and when it was a decision where you said, oh, I need to write about this. Was it someone that encouraged you? Was it you came that to yourself?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the genesis was over a period of probably 6 or 7 years. So when I first came across his work, this was 2004 or so, and was using it professionally. And then, as I mentioned, I had that aha, that insight of, oh, if I'm going to do what I'm meant to do, whatever that is. We have these vague notions of what I'm meant to do, and we have no idea what that is, but that I would need to leave Wall Street, become an entrepreneur, and disrupt myself. And so I think that was when I had the kernel of an idea that disruption wasn't just about products, but also about people. But that's 2004. And so, it's 2005, 2006, I become an entrepreneur. I end up then working with him in a nonprofit setting at our church. I was working with him in public affairs and public relations. And so had this interaction with him, but then co-founded the Disruptive Innovation Fund with him and his son in 2007. And so during that period, that 2007 to 2011 period, I'm thinking about disruption all the time. And this idea of personal disruption is percolating. And where it really started to take hold for me is probably in 2010, 2011. I wrote a series of articles for Harvard Business Review on personal disruption, and then wrote an article in the magazine called Disrupt Yourself. And that was really where I remember people saying, oh, that's interesting. And you have something. And they were really taken by that idea. But it was this gradual process. But me finally writing it down, having people respond to it, having me realize, oh, yeah, there actually is something here. It's not just this nice idea in your head.
I'm just curious, did you ever see yourself writing a book, early on in your career? Was that an aspiration you had? Or was it just, okay, I've got this really good idea that's been affirmed by others, and I need to put it out there. I'm just curious.
Yeah. Stephen, it's a great question. I think that, I graduated from college in music, and I really didn't know what I was going to be when I grew up. I was going to be a mother and have children, which I have done. But then my husband and I, he graduated, we go to New York, he's getting his PhD, we have to put food on the table. And I start working because we need food, but I didn't really still at that point have some idea of what I was going to do or be. I started as a secretary, but then am able to move into investment banking because I have a boss who believes in me. But even then, I was disrupting my mindset of what I thought was possible. And so that's a very long-winded way of saying, no, I did not plan on writing a book. That was not a career aspiration. It's so funny because I just sent my 4th book to the publisher, and I still am not quite self-identifying as a writer, but probably I'm to the point where I should call myself, I am a writer. But here's what I would say to you, and I think this is very important. Carl Jung said, the greatest influence on a child is the unlived life of a parent. And my mother always wanted to write a book, and she never did. And I'm the oldest child. So I'm pretty sure that there was some kind of imprinting or longing that was embedded in my psyche, so that while I did not plan on writing a book, I did not intend to write a book, there was somehow that was going to happen because of that unlived life of a parent.
That's really fascinating to think about. What kind of DNA remnants? Yeah, I think like what's inside me that's maybe waiting to come forth, right? That's
Mhm.
really cool. I don't know if I've heard that quote before. So with kind of shifting gears a little bit. So with Disrupt Yourself, I thought something was interesting when I read the recent version, the newer version, the updated version
Mhm.
that came out, and
Mhm.
something you mentioned in it was that there was an inaccurate perception that the book had only applied to, say, entrepreneurs or people that were going through a career change, which
Mhm.
honestly was my first initial impression when I saw it until I got into it. But it's actually meant for all strong performers. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk on a high level, why is personal disruption, that idea, so important for strong performers and I guess people in general in today's world?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think the perception was there in part because I created that perception. Whenever you start something, or at least for me, I tend to start with the specific and then generalize over time. And personal disruption, you start in this place of the bottom of the ladder, you climb to the top, and then you jump to the bottom of a new ladder. And so the most obvious idea is, high school, you start at the bottom, you climb to the top, college, first job, second job, first role, second role. It's super a very obvious way to think about it. And when someone leaves a job that they feel like it's time to do something new, just like I did when I left Wall Street, it's very easy to say, I'm going to disrupt myself. And so that is absolutely one application, and it's a great starting point. And when you think about the framework of personal disruption, it is in fact a way of life. Because if you are going to make any progress at all in your life, you need to continually be disrupting yourself. You need to continually be stepping back from who you are to slingshot into who you want to be. And if you think about the math of personal disruption, and this will really drive it home, is that whenever you disrupt yourself, if you think about the y axis of success, let's say you're at a 12 in whatever part of your life, and you're moving along in life, over one, up one, over one, up one. Things are moving along just fine, but you believe that there's something better for you. So you make that conscious decision to go from the 12 down to the 10 because you believe in the future it will be over one, up three, or over one, up five. So the slope of your line is much steeper. And so that's not just about your career, that's every single day of your life. That's every time you say to yourself, okay, you know what? I just kind of was short with my husband this morning because I was worried about a paper that I had to turn in. And so, how do I disrupt myself? I go to him and I say, honey, I'm really sorry. I was kind of anxious this morning. And so I snapped at you. Please forgive me. That's disrupting myself. It's stepping back from who I was to slingshot into the person who I want to be, which is a person who is kind and gentle, even when they're under a lot of pressure. And so that was the misperception that it was just about careers, but in fact, any person at any time that wants to make progress in anything that they are doing is continually disrupting themselves.
I love that. It makes so much sense, and it reminds me. I'm just trying to connect it to some other kind of mental models in my head, and one of my impressions reading this was there. I think there's some parallels between the idea of a private victory precedes public victory, right?
Mm,
Where and I think of like the S curve, and that was kind of where I wanted to go next with it. But that was something my grandpa used to talk about a lot, and I have totally believe in that principle that if you win kind of internally with yourself first, it leads to the public wins, the public victories, what people are seeing. But it starts inside, right? It's the whole inside out approach, which I just love. It just
yeah.
makes so much sense to me. So that's where I kind of drew a parallel with just some of the frameworks I have in my head was kind of this idea of inside out and private victory precedes public victory.
Oh, I
Um,
love that. Private victory precedes public victory. And before you conquer the mountain, you conquer yourself. Yeah, that's fantastic.
and how does it relate? So you talk about the S curve, and
Mm.
I'm sure many listeners that are listening probably know what the S curve is, but there may be some that it's a new concept. So originally it was a model created by E.M. Rogers, right? Is
Yeah, well, it
he,
wasn't created, but it was very
it
much popularized by him.
okay? So and
Yeah.
it was initially it was a model to attempt to understand um, how and why and kind of the rate at which new products are going, right? And I know
Mhm.
that and then the S curve has been applied to many different uh,
Yep.
uh, concepts and ideas. So how does the S curve play into disrupting yourself?
All of
Um,
this. Okay.
yeah.
All right, here we go. So as I said, I had this first insight about personal disruption, that disruption doesn't just apply to products, it applies to people. And then the second big insight that I had is we're using the S curve to figure out how quickly an innovation will be adopted, like you said. And then I had this aha. You can sense a theme. I like to apply everything to the individual. I had this aha that the S curve could also help us understand how we learn and how we grow. So every time you and I start something new, we are at the base of that S. And so we're at the base of that S. Growth is happening, but it's not yet apparent. And so it feels slow. We can get discouraged. We can get impatient. We can get frustrated. That's why it's so hard for us to start something and gain momentum, because we're at that base of the S and we can't see our progress. It's not discernible. But then we put in the effort. And as we put in the effort, we accelerate, we hit the knee of that curve and that sleek, steep back of the S. And now, whereas it took a lot of time for a little bit to happen, now in a little time, a lot happens. And it's hard, but it's not too hard. It's easy, but it's not too easy. All of your neurons are firing. It's exhilarating. It looks and it feels fast. And it is just the sweet spot of that S curve. And then as you approach mastery, you will be very good at what you were doing. In fact, so good that you can get a little bit bored. You're considered a master. And so, whereas at the launch point you were overwhelmed, now you're somewhat underwhelmed because you're no longer enjoying the feel good effects of learning. And so, you need to do something new. You've completed that growth cycle. And so, you need to jump to the bottom of a new S curve. So, how do these two fit together? Well, the S curve helps you understand what growth looks like. It gives you this mental model to think about growth so that anytime you start something new, you can say, oh, no wonder I'm uncomfortable. I'm on the launch point. Or, oh, no wonder I'm having so much fun. I'm in the sweet spot. Or, oh, no wonder I'm really good at this, but I feel like I can't do it another day because I'm in mastery and it's time for me to do something new. So when you know where you are, you increase your capacity to grow, you orient yourself. And so that can impact you and it can help you grow the people around you. So the S curve is basically telling you where you are on the mountain. When you start a new project, am I at the launch point, the sweet spot, or mastery? Personal disruption is, think about it, it's the tools that you put in your backpack to help you get up that mountain. It's the changes that you need to make inside yourself, the personal victories that will precede that public victory that help you get up that mountain. It's the disrupting that's taking place. And there's a whole framework that we can go into if you want, but that is what it is at a very high level. It's the changes you make, the tools in your backpack that make it possible to make it up your S curve mountain.
That's amazing and very very well described. I can tell how passionate you are about this stuff just by the way you communicate. So it's getting me excited, and I can relate. As I read this book, and I mentioned to you before we started recording that I've been in my career. I've been in three very different industries, and so I felt like as I was reading, I was like, oh my gosh, this was exactly kind of what I went through these three different times where I had to start at the bottom of the S curve and make my way up. So I think that's one of the kind of the paradigms that I've taken away from this is, number one, obviously the idea of personal disruption in general, which I think is kind of a paradigm shift, but then also just being aware of the S curve and being able to take a step back and say, oh, I'm experiencing this.
Mm-hmm.
That's I mean, that's a powerful thing. I mean, even now in my own life, I'm looking at it. And then one other thing that just came to mind that I was just thinking about was um, this idea. I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase of, living life in crescendo, right? Where you're always.
I have not, but as a music major, it certainly appeals to me.
Yeah, yeah. So I've always loved the concept, and I've heard it said before that you live life in crescendo, so that it's not this idea that you're um, just getting to the point of retirement, and then
Mm,
you just are just kind of done, and now you can relax. Whereas living life in crescendo is like your best days are ahead of you. You're always progressing, always new things happening. And I just thought of just a connection of,
mm.
it's like you can think of it as just like getting on more S curves, right? Going up
Right.
as you continually grow and everything. So I know that was kind of a random thought, but I just kind of made that connection. So just wanted to
Yeah,
mention it.
I love that because Stephen, don't we all know people who get to be 85 years old and their life is it's it, it's sort of they're sort of glad that it's over. And we don't want to feel that way. We want to feel like, our last day was our best day. That I love that, living our life. What did you say? Living our life in crescendo?
Yep, living your life in crescendo. Yep,
I love that.
it's
Okay.
yeah.
Just going like this. Get louder.
That's exactly right. Um, so you go through and you talk about, and we don't have time to cover all of it, but you talk about there's 7 variables along this S curve.
Mhm.
So I'll read them off, and then I just want to ask you a question about them. So there's take the right risks, play to your distinctive strengths, embrace constraints, battle entitlement, step back to grow, give failure its due, and be discovery driven. So, is there one out of the 7 that you would consider most important, or is it really individual, situational, case by case basis?
Um, yes, there is one that I would consider. There actually, can I do two? Will you give me two?
Yes, you are.
I'm
Yes, you are free.
negotiating with
You are
you.
free. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to go with number 4, battle entitlement, which actually I have renamed to examine expectations. I realize that, and so let me talk you through what it is. So examine expectations, and this goes back to the S curve, is that our brains are constantly running these predictive models. And so whenever we jump on a new S curve, we move to a new city, we take on a new job, we start a new hobby, we have children, whatever it is, we have this predictive model of what it's going to be like and what do we need to do to move up that curve. Well, when we're at the launch point of that S curve, we're making those predictions, and our predictions are wrong a lot of the time. And so our dopamine is dropping. And then, so that's why it's so hard to start and hard to gain momentum. But then what's going to happen as we move it in the sweet spot is that our dopamine, or we're going to get our predictions right more and more of the time, but not all the time. So we're going to be surprised a lot. So we get dopamine, upside surprise. That's why stocks go up when there's an upside surprise, because we get that dopamine squirt. And then when we get into mastery, because we've figured out the model, we're not getting as much dopamine. And so basically, all along the curve, you're managing that dopamine. The reason it's so important is that so often we fall into this place of should. Things should be different. And when we start doing should, which is basically we're not managing our dopamine, we become a victim and we start being acted upon instead of acting. And so that number 4, examine expectations, it's right in the middle. In some ways, it's a fulcrum, because if we are going to make it up that curve, we need to be in this place where no matter what, we are not competing with what's happening, we are creating with what's happening. And so we want to continually examine our expectations and manage for continually giving ourselves these upside surprises of dopamine, because then we will continually make progress. The second one I was going to mention was one that has surprised me recently, and it didn't used to be the case, but it's been the case recently, and that is step back to grow. And I've talked a bit about this of, you crouch before you jump and you bring a fist back to punch, and this idea of moving down the y-axis of success to slingshot forward. But the reason I'm raising this one is because over the last 18 months, the step back to grow isn't just mobility in your career, it's also a willingness to take time to rest, to take time to reflect, to go on a vacation, because if so many people are overwhelmed that they're trying to go up the mountain and sprint up the mountain, and we just can't do that. So we need to take that time to pause and say, where am I on the mountain? What does it look like? Probably better sleep and have, camp out tonight before I make it back up. And so that one's important as well, because if we are feeling strong and healthy and nourished, then we will have the physical capacity, which will lead us to have the cognitive and emotional capacity to make it up that mountain. So step back mentally, emotionally, physically, in order to grow and move up the curve.
I really like that. So it's not just in the sense of if you're going through a career change or something, and you need to step back to kind of start in a new field or endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
It's also, you can apply it kind of personally as well. I didn't even think of that. So that's really well said. So one of the other ones I wanted to ask you about, which I feel like is relevant in today's world too, is the sixth one. Give failure its due. And
Okay.
I can relate to this one. But I think, let me tell you what, maybe I'll describe how I kind of interpret it, and then I'd love to hear you maybe expound on it or correct me. But it seems like sometimes in our lives, when we feel like we're making progress, and in this context, you're moving up the S curve, and then something happens, like you get fired or something really fortunate, you have all these kind of setbacks that happen. And I think the initial reaction is, I made all this progress, things were going really well, and then this setback happened, and it's just devastating for most people. I feel like a lot of people have struggled getting out of that.
Mm-hmm.
And the point of this, what you're saying is that the failure can actually, many times down the road, as you look back and reflect on it, you could say, you know what, that actually was part of the journey. It had to happen that way.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, am I interpreting it right, or is there more you would add to kind of how I
Yes,
describe it?
you are interpreting it right. And as you said, I mean, if we look at our lives and our greatest accomplishments frequently, and in some ways, I would almost argue always, but that's probably a little strong. So we'll just go with frequently. Our greatest accomplishments have come, or the seeds of that great accomplishment was sown with the seeds of some failure, something that didn't work, and a lesson that we learned as a consequence. The thing that I would add to that, Stephen, is this: failure and mistakes are not actually the problem. It's the shame that we associate with the mistakes. It's when that failure or that mistake, that thing that didn't work, becomes a referendum on us. And that some people are much better at that than others. I remember not too long ago when I was actually interviewing Alan Mulally, who was the CEO of Ford, and he turned Ford around. He was the CEO of Boeing Commercial Airplanes. And I had a question for him. I said, how do you think about failure? I mean, I'm an oldest child. I tend to be a perfectionist. I don't take failure well, or historically did not. And I said, so how do you think about failure? And he said, I don't. And I said, no, really, like, how do you think about failure? And again, he said, I don't. And I took one more lap trying to ask him again. He said, I don't think about failure. He said, when I make a mistake, I see it as a gem. It's something to learn. And so that's been a really wonderful lesson for me. And so the reason I say give failure its due is leverage failure, is say to yourself, okay, the more mistakes I make, the better I'm going to get faster. And so if I can jettison and ditch the shame, if I can take my ego off the table and out of the equation, then I'm going to get better a lot faster. And so failure to me, as I'm growing and developing and trying to eat my own cooking, becomes a tool of creation and something that gives us momentum to move up our S curve.
This whole conversation, and I feel like this happens on a lot of my episodes of the podcast, but it's always in the moment, because I'm talking to amazing people like you and thought leaders. Like, I always have like these existential moments in the middle of the podcast where I'm just like, wow, like I need to leave for a second to process everything. So
Well, wait,
that's
so stop. What was it? What was your existential moment that you just had? Do tell.
well,
Listeners want
it's
to know.
yeah, it's just I've had a couple things like in my life that I've really labeled as failures
Mm,
in my life, and just that subtle shift of looking at those as a gem, as the person you referenced. It sounds very simple, but just that one thought alone, it was more like, you know what, ironically have a podcast about paradigms and haven't even examined. There's kind of two in particular things that have happened in my life that I totally have labeled as like a failure and totally my fault,
uh-huh.
and have not given myself grace or patience or understanding, and just a realization that I need to look at those instances in my life as part of the process, and just to look at it as a gem instead. So I
Yeah.
think it's going to take some work
Yeah.
on
Oh,
my
yeah.
end, right? It's
Yeah.
not like an
Yeah.
instantaneous thing, but
Yeah.
I think I can look at it in a new light. So that's what I was
Oh,
referring
I love
to
it.
is yeah.
I love it. Okay, so I have to tell you something that is really interesting. First of all, I'll tell you a story and then I have an idea. So the story is I was talking to one of my colleagues and he was telling me, we were getting acquainted. We didn't know each other very well, and I asked him to tell me his story, and he told me his story. And then a couple of weeks later, I find out that when he was in college, was was a like top 10 tennis player internationally, or not nationally, excuse me, in the United States when he's in college. And he failed to tell me that. He's telling me everything he did in his career, and he did not tell me. He just so happened to omit top 10 tennis player in college. I'm like, why didn't you tell me that? That's a big deal. That's amazing. That's super interesting. And do you know what he said to me? He said, I didn't tell you because I was embarrassed and ashamed that I hadn't gone pro. And then I said to him, it's always the shame. There's gold where there is shame, because there's something there that's tender and raw and valuable. And if we'll go look in it and pick through that rubble, we're going to find some really, it's like the dragon, right? We're going to find something super magical about ourselves. Isn't that cool?
That Yeah, no, that really is cool, and I've never had it presented to me in that way, that if you're experiencing shame about something, that's actually like it's an opportunity, and actually you should look there, right? Because there's some great things that could come out of it.
Yeah,
So
there's
yeah,
something magical there.
so like for me, it's yeah, in these two kind of experiences I've had in my life, this really is like, I think, an opportunity for me to reframe it, because I think I've just so like I've labeled it so hardly. Like in my
Mhm.
mind, it's like solidified in there, and I think this has kind of helped me say, you know what, that doesn't have to be the case,
Yeah.
and I think there is a way that I can either relabel it or see it as part of kind of my whole process, and I really do think that's possible.
Yeah.
It's just kind
Oh,
of
yeah.
structurally been a part of me for so long. It's hard to maybe accept
Ooh.
that too. So
Oh, I love it. Okay, here's the idea. So you just said this, you're doing 40 podcasts total, right?
yes, yep.
So after your last one, do the 41st podcast and do a solo episode where you talk through a lesson or something you did differently as a consequence of every single podcast.
That's a really great idea. I love it. I'm definitely going to incorporate that. I had an idea of doing something like that, some kind of recap episode, but I think because it's true, every episode I've done, I've always walked away with something personally. So
Mhm.
and I think a lot of times the personal lessons, there's at least someone out there that can also relate to that as well. So I will definitely make a note of that to do it.
Oh, yeah, it'll be awesome. So, okay.
Awesome. Well, Whitney, to kind of to wrap up, there's two questions that I always like to end with. The first one is kind of around what a practical action step would be for a listener. So someone that's listening to this podcast, and you were to give them advice on what's a practical, visible action they could take in regards to disrupting themselves. How would you advise them in that way?
Okay, so based on the conversation that we just had, I'm going to give you two. The first one is step back to grow. So if you're unplug for an hour or take time to reflect on your day. If it's 30 seconds, what was your sweet for the day? What was your sour for the day? So simple things, unplug for an hour, sweet and sour, just step back and reflect. And so that your brain can have some space and time to get inspiration and the rest and the rejuvenation you need. Tiffany Shlain, this wonderful author of 24/6, said, "What if we thought of rest as technology? Technology makes our lives better, and rest, if done well, can make our lives better as well." So that would be the first practical thing, is take time to step back to grow. The second thing I would say is just to think about this S curve. And the next time you find yourself doing something new and you find yourself feeling uncomfortable or resisting it or not wanting to do it or awkward or embarrassed, just remember, oh yeah, I'm at the launch point of the curve. This is normal. This is exactly how I'm supposed to feel. And then pat yourself on the back for doing something new.
Last question is, pretend that you were sitting one-on-one with someone who was just starting off in their career, and they asked you about success, both in terms of what is success and how to be successful. How would you go about approaching that answer?
So, what is success? I would say success is at the end of your life, you have become a person that you like, that you respect, that you love, and you can say to yourself, good job, I did it.
Whitney, there's a lot that you said today that was so enlightening. I'm sure listeners are excited. I'll make sure to link to your work, your podcast that everyone needs to listen to. But again, I sincerely appreciate your time today for being on the podcast, and am so grateful just for the insight that you've shared, and just your energy and kind of passion for this. You can feel it. If you're watching on YouTube or listening, you can feel it, and I can see it, and it literally has rubbed off on me today. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Stephen. It's been a lot of fun.